The hum of the room was that of an elite institution, where only the best minds were welcomed, and success was measured by brilliance and pedigree. And then the door opened. Maria stood in the doorway, feeling like an imposter in her plain white blouse and ill-fitting black slacks. Her worn leather shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. She was the last to arrive, her breath coming in sharp, nervous bursts as she stepped into the vast room. Students turned their heads, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled judgment. They couldn't help but notice her humble appearance, so out of place among the well-tailored suits and designer glasses of the other students. Maria was not like them. She didn't come from their world. She wasn't from a prestigious background or an Ivy League school. She wasn't even supposed to be here. She had always been a simple accounting clerk, sitting in her cramped office during lunch breaks, her only company the hum of her computer and the stacks of paperwork she meticulously went through. But Maria had a secret. She had always loved mathematics. Numbers, equations, and formulas made sense to her in ways that people often didn't. She was a self-taught prodigy, solving advanced calculus problems at night, using online resources and free textbooks, teaching herself everything they taught in university classrooms, and even more. Today, Maria was here because Dr. McGowan's special program had recognized her brilliance they had found through her perfect score on an online mathematical challenge. They didn't know how she'd learned it, no formal education, no degree, but the results spoke for themselves. Maria's legs felt like lead as she walked to an empty seat in the front. Her hands fidgeted nervously with her bag, unsure where to place it. The whispers started almost immediately. "She's from that new program, right?" "Yeah, no formal education. What is she doing here? Does she even know how to solve calculus problems? She's just a receptionist, right?" She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Their words bounced off her like they always did. But her nerves couldn't be quieted. Dr. McGowan was a legend, a brilliant mathematician who had little patience for underachievers, for anyone who didn't belong. Maria sat down, her back straight, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as she tried to focus on the lecture. But she could feel the eyes on her, the judgment. The cool gaze of Dr. McGowan swept across the room, landing on Maria briefly before she continued with her lecture. Maria's heart was pounding in her chest. Was this really where she belonged? Was it a mistake to even step foot in this hall? "Ms. Dela Cruz, would you like to attempt a problem?" Dr. McGowan's voice sliced through the air, cool and commanding. Maria's breath caught, her mouth dried. She had expected this, the challenge, the test, but nothing could have prepared her for the scrutiny that came with it. Every student's eyes were locked on her, silently daring her to fail. The problem Dr. McGowan wrote on the board was no ordinary equation. It was a complex, multivariable calculus problem, one that required intricate steps and a deep understanding of concepts. Dr. McGowan's eyes glinted with something sharper, an unspoken challenge. "Let's see if your self-taught knowledge holds up in the real world. Go ahead." Maria stood slowly, her palms sweating. Her legs trembled with the weight of every student's gaze on her. She walked to the board, every step heavier than the last. As she gripped the chalk, she tried to ignore the whispers behind her, the mocking glances, but she couldn't. She could hear their laughter, the disbelief in their voices. She felt the world closing in on her. Her eyes traced the problem, every detail, every variable. For a moment, time stood still. This was her moment. This was everything she had worked for. She had to get it right, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever doubted her. She picked up the chalk, her hand steady despite the storm, raging inside her. "I can do this," she whispered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. The silence in the room was deafening. Maria began writing her solution on the board, her mind racing, her hands moving with a precision she didn't know she had. She didn't just want to solve the problem. She wanted to show them all, show Dr. McGowan, show everyone that she belonged here. And then, as the room waited with bated breath, she started to unlock the equation, breaking it down in ways they hadn't expected, finding connections that the textbook didn't teach. And as the final answer appeared on the board, the air seemed to freeze. The students stared, wide-eyed. Even Dr. McGowan's stoic face flickered with the briefest hint of surprise, but Maria's work wasn't done yet. The university building loomed above Maria, its glass facade gleaming under the midday sun. It was a striking contrast to her own modest appearance, a simple blouse, faded black slacks, and a worn leather bag that had seen better days. She stood at the entrance of the lecture hall, the weight of her decision settling in her chest, her heart beating faster with each breath she took. Today was the day. Today she was going to prove something not just to herself, but to the world. Maria Dela Cruz was 30 years old. To many, she was just another number, a clerk in a small accounting firm, crunching numbers for a living. But Maria wasn't just another worker. She wasn't content to simply punch in data and call it a day. When the office was quiet during lunch breaks, when her co-workers chatted about weekend plans, Maria would sit quietly at her desk, scribbling formulas, solving equations. Numbers had always been her language. While others saw them as tools for their jobs, Maria saw beauty, patterns, and possibility. Her passion for mathematics had started in her childhood back in Manila, when her father, a former high school teacher, would sit with her and help her solve simple arithmetic problems. Over the years, as she grew older, her love for numbers only deepened, but her life was far from the world of academia. She had never attended a prestigious school, never had access to the kinds of resources that other students at the university had. Instead, she was a self-taught student, using free online resources, public libraries, and old textbooks to learn more advanced mathematical concepts, calculus, differential equations, theorems that seemed too complex for someone like her. But Maria had a secret. She was good, really good. The kind of good that made her solutions to problems not only correct but elegant. She had discovered patterns in advanced calculus problems that even PhD students couldn't see. And though she never shared her abilities with anyone, Maria couldn't help but feel that this was the life she was meant for. The life of equations, proofs, and intellectual challenge. Yet she was always too afraid to pursue it publicly. After all, who would take a Filipino woman with no formal training seriously? Then came the email, the invitation to participate in Dr. McGowan's Advanced Mathematics program, a pilot project seeking out exceptional, untapped minds with no formal academic background. It was a risky opportunity. Dr. McGowan's program wasn't something that typically allowed outsiders to participate, especially not someone with no credentials, no degrees to their name. But when Maria's solution to an online mathematical challenge caught the eye of the department, everything changed. For the first time, someone recognized her. Maria had always been careful to remain anonymous, but this time, her curiosity about higher-level mathematics had opened a door. The invitation came with an offer. She could audit an advanced calculus class with the possibility of earning a full scholarship to pursue a degree. The fear of rejection was almost overwhelming. What if they laughed at her? What if they saw right through her and realized she was just a fraud, an outsider pretending to be something she wasn't? But her passion won out. This was the chance she had been waiting for, the opportunity to prove, not just to others, but to herself, that she could be more than just the sum of her past. Now, as Maria stood at the entrance of the lecture hall, her stomach churned with a mix of excitement and dread. The lecture hall was immense, filled with students who looked so sure of themselves, so well put together. They wore tailored clothes, sleek hairstyles, and carried brand-new laptops. Maria felt out of place, like a ghost in a crowd of brilliant minds, unworthy of being among them. She could feel the judgment already. She had seen it before when she entered the building, the fleeting glances and the hushed whispers. Her appearance alone was enough to make her an outsider in their eyes. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The door swung open with a soft creak, and the sound of bustling conversations suddenly stopped. Every head in the room turned toward her, eyes scanning her modest attire, the worn-out bag at her side. Maria's cheeks flushed under their gaze, but she didn't falter. She had come this far. She wasn't turning back now. At the front of the room stood Dr. McGowan, a striking woman in her late 40s, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her crisp white shirt and black blazer screamed authority, and when she surveyed the room, it was as if her very presence demanded silence. Dr. McGowan was legendary in academic circles, a woman whose name was synonymous with excellence in mathematics. And yet, Maria had been chosen, selected by Dr. McGowan's program, for something that no one else could see: potential. Maria found an empty seat at the front of the room. As she sat down, she could feel the weight of the students' eyes on her. A couple of students murmured under their breath, "She's from that new program, right?" One whispered, "No formal education. What's she even doing here?" Another added. Maria kept her gaze on her notebook, trying to ignore the whispers, trying to block out the sinking feeling in her stomach. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to prove that she could belong, that she was as capable as any of them, if not more so. The lecture began, and Dr. McGowan's voice filled the room with confidence. Her words were clear, precise, a familiar rhythm of advanced calculus that Maria had spent years studying on her own. The language of numbers was her comfort zone, and as Dr. McGowan launched into a lecture on partial differential equations, Maria's nerves began to settle. She was in her element, and for the first time in a long while, Maria allowed herself to feel like she was exactly where she needed to be. But that calm didn't last long. As the lecture continued, Maria began to notice the small shifts in the room, the glances, the whispers, the subtle laughter. There was no mistake about it. She was the subject of ridicule. She wasn't like them. She didn't have the polished academic history or the pedigree they had. Suddenly, Dr. McGowan's sharp voice cut through the air. "Ms. Dela Cruz," she said, her tone like ice. The room fell silent. Maria's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, Dr. McGowan," Maria responded, her voice steady, despite the nerves bubbling beneath her skin. "I see you've been quite focused. During my lecture, perhaps you can solve this problem for us." Dr. McGowan's gaze was piercing as she turned toward the board and wrote a complicated equation in chalk. "Go ahead, show us your method." Maria's blood ran cold. The room seemed to shrink as every student turned their attention toward her. The problem was monstrous, an intricate mess of multivariable calculus, one that Maria had only seen in textbooks, one that required advanced understanding and a meticulous, step-by-step process. Maria stood up slowly, every eye in the room on her. The chalk felt cold in her hand, her fingers trembling. She had solved problems like this before, many times, but this wasn't just a problem. It was a challenge that could expose her in front of everyone. The room was silent as she approached the board, each step heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the doubt in their gazes. She took a deep breath. She could do this. She had to. This wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about proving that she belonged here, in this room, among these students, in this world of mathematics. She raised the chalk, and with the first line of the equation, the silence in the room grew thicker. The clock was ticking, and Maria's fate was about to be sealed. The room was cold. The lecture hall buzzed with a mix of excitement and boredom, a typical Monday morning at the university. The students shifted in their seats, restless, as Dr. McGowan paced at the front, her eyes scanning the room, dissecting each student in turn. Her sharp gaze was something many students had learned to avoid, but Maria couldn't look away. Every word Dr. McGowan spoke was like a subtle blade, cutting through the air, cutting into her heart. Maria had felt the weight of the room as soon as she entered, the silent judgment that had followed her every step. They weren't used to someone like her in this space, someone who didn't belong, someone who didn't fit the mold, the whispers, the glances. They were all there, simmering beneath the surface. But Maria refused to let it break her. She had worked too hard for this moment, this chance to prove herself. Dr. McGowan was not just any professor. She was legendary. Known for her brilliance and her ruthless approach to teaching, she had earned a reputation for breaking students, both mentally and emotionally. The rumors about her were enough to make even the most confident students tremble, but Maria was determined not to let fear control her. This was her time. As Dr. McGowan's lecture unfolded, Maria focused on the material. She understood the complex ideas and equations being thrown on the board, recognizing the patterns that had taken years of self-study to decode. Every now and then, Dr. McGowan would glance at her, a slight curl of the lip, a look that suggested Maria was an anomaly, an unwelcome guest in this world of rigor and pedigree. Maria's heart skipped. She had prepared herself for this, but it didn't make it any easier. "I see some of you are struggling to follow," Dr. McGowan said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't worry, it's common. For those who belong here, that is." The implication was clear. There were those who truly belonged in this world of academia. And then there were people like Maria, people who had no right to even consider themselves part of it. Maria could feel the eyes of the students on her as they whispered, their words designed to sting, to diminish her. She didn't belong here, they thought. They had seen the rumors about the new program Dr. McGowan was running, the one for people like her, outsiders with no formal credentials, yet undeniable talent. They couldn't fathom how someone like Maria could possibly understand calculus. "Look at her," one student whispered. "She's not even wearing the right clothes for this. She looks like she belongs at a desk somewhere, not solving complex math problems." Another student, a young man with an expensive suit and an air of superiority, snickered. "What's she doing here anyway? Doesn't she know this is real math?" Maria gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. She could feel their eyes boring into her, their doubt and mockery sharp and suffocating. But she refused to look at them. Instead, she focused on the lecture, on the equations Dr. McGowan was scrawling on the board, trying to drown out the noise of their judgment. "Now, class," Dr. McGowan said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Let's put the theories into practice. Who here thinks they can solve this?" She turned and wrote a complicated equation on the board, an advanced multi-step problem that would challenge even the most prepared minds. Maria felt the air grow heavier as the professor's gaze swept over the room. There was a coldness in her eyes, an expectation that no one would dare challenge her authority. And then, as if by some cruel fate, Dr. McGowan's eyes landed on her. "Miss Dela Cruz," Dr. McGowan called, her voice calm but icy, as though she had already decided Maria's fate before even speaking. "You seem to be quite comfortable with the material. Care to show us how you would solve this problem?" The silence that followed was deafening. Maria froze. The weight of every student's gaze was now fixed on her, burning through her. She had come prepared. She knew how to solve this equation, but that didn't matter. In that moment, it wasn't just about solving a math problem. It was about proving her worth to everyone in the room. Maria swallowed hard, her throat dry. I don't know if I'm ready," she began, but Dr. McGowan cut her off sharply. "You seem confident enough to be taking notes during my lecture," Dr. McGowan said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "So, let's see how well you can put that knowledge to use." There it was, the challenge. The moment Maria had feared, the moment where she would either prove herself or be crushed under the weight of her insecurities and the scorn of those who never thought she belonged here. The pressure was unbearable. Maria's palms began to sweat, and she felt a flicker of doubt creep into her mind. Was this the right decision? Was she really equipped to face the scrutiny of the professor and the entire class? But no, she couldn't back down. She had come this far, and this was her chance to show them who she was. Taking a deep breath, Maria stood up slowly, her legs shaky beneath her. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her, their judgment hanging heavy in the air. She moved toward the board, each step feeling like an eternity. The chalk in her hand felt cold and unfamiliar, and for a moment she hesitated. But there was no turning back now. She began writing the equation on the board, her mind racing as she tried to recall the steps necessary to solve it. The problem was complex, but it was familiar. She had worked on similar problems countless times in her self-study sessions. As she worked, Maria could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her, each whisper growing louder. "She's going to fail," one student murmured. "She doesn't even know how to approach this. Just wait." But Maria pushed forward. Her chalk moved across the board in a fluid, precise motion, breaking the problem down step by step. Every move was calculated, every thought deliberate. She wasn't just solving the equation. She was showing them all that she belonged here, that she was just as capable as any of them. She could feel the energy in the room shift, the whispers growing quieter, as if the students were finally realizing that Maria wasn't the simple, unqualified woman they had assumed her to be. Minutes passed. The problem began to take shape. On the board, Maria's confidence grew with each step, and she felt herself falling into a rhythm. This was her moment. She was doing it. She was solving the problem. She was proving them all wrong. And then, just as she reached the final steps, Dr. McGowan's voice broke the silence. "Interesting," she said, her tone colder than ever. "But not quite the approach I was expecting." Maria's heart sank. Dr. McGowan stepped forward, her eyes scanning the work on the board with a critical gaze. "This solution is unconventional," Dr. McGowan said slowly, as if weighing each word. "But it's not wrong. You've solved it in a way that none of us would have considered." A slight frown tugged at Maria's lips. Her mind raced. Was this praise? Or was Dr. McGowan setting her up for failure, preparing to tear her down? The room was still, the tension unbearable. Maria felt a flicker of hope, but it quickly dissipated as Dr. McGowan continued. However, Dr. McGowan's voice was sharp, cutting through the air. "This is not the solution we use in academia. It's too raw, too unpolished. You've solved it, yes, but you're still nothing more than an outsider playing at something you don't fully understand." Maria's chest tightened. The sting of the words hit her harder than she expected. Dr. McGowan's gaze was unwavering, and the other students exchanged glances. The room had shifted again, but this time it wasn't in Maria's favor. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She had come here to prove herself, to show them that talent couldn't be measured by credentials alone. But Dr. McGowan's words made her feel small, insignificant. "And as for your place in this program," Dr. McGowan continued, her voice laced with authority, "I'm afraid we may have made a mistake." Maria's breath caught in her throat. Was this it? Had she failed? Before she could respond, Dr. McGowan turned to the rest of the class, her voice now dripping with disdain. "Let this be a lesson in the dangers of accepting students who have no real understanding of mathematics." The tension in the room was suffocating, and Maria could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on her. The judgment, the ridicule. It was all too much. But then, from the back of the room, a voice broke through the silence. "That was brilliant," the student from earlier, one who had mocked her, spoke up. "She solved it in a way none of us even thought of. I think she deserves more than just a second glance." Maria looked up in surprise. The room was still, but the small shift in energy was enough. Some students nodded in agreement, others were silent, but there was an undeniable shift happening. But Dr. McGowan's face remained cold, impassive. "We'll see," she said quietly. The tension hadn't broken yet. It was far from over. The air in the lecture hall was thick with tension. Maria's heart hammered in her chest, her throat dry as she stood before the chalkboard. She could feel Dr. McGowan's piercing eyes on her, the weight of every student's gaze heavy upon her shoulders. The challenge had been issued, and Maria had no choice but to accept it. The equation on the board was an intricate beast of multivariable calculus, a complex maze of symbols and numbers that twisted and turned in ways Maria had never before encountered in a classroom. Her mind was racing, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She could feel the sweat gathering at her palms, but she forced herself to steady her hand. The pressure was suffocating. One mistake, one misstep, and she would be exposed as a fraud in front of everyone. Maria couldn't let that happen. She had to do this, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever doubted her. The chalk felt cold and foreign in her hand as she gripped it tightly. For a moment, she just stared at the equation, allowing the familiar patterns to surface in her mind. This problem wasn't impossible. She had solved similar equations before, alone in her dimly lit apartment on late nights after work. But this wasn't just about the math. This was about her proving she belonged here, in this world of academia, in this world that had so often made her feel invisible. Maria took a deep breath, forcing her thoughts into focus. She began writing, each line a small battle against the doubts clouding her mind. The students sat in absolute silence, waiting for her to falter, to fail, to give them the validation they expected. But Maria was determined. As her chalk swept across the board, her method began to take shape, unconventional perhaps, but undeniably brilliant. The first few steps were standard, the kind of formulaic approach any student could follow. But Maria wasn't just solving the equation. She was thinking beyond the textbook, beyond the rules they had all been taught. Her mind was moving faster than her hand could keep up, recognizing shortcuts, elegant transformations that bypassed unnecessary steps. She wasn't simply solving the problem. She was deconstructing it, rearranging it in a way that made sense only to her. The room remained deathly silent as Maria continued, her chalk moving in rhythmic strokes, almost as if the equation were unfolding before her like a map. Her movements were deliberate, precise, nothing hurried, nothing forced. It was as though the solution was whispering itself to her, guiding her through the steps with a quiet confidence that she hadn't expected to feel. But still, doubt gnawed at her. What if she made a mistake? What if her method was wrong? What if Dr. McGowan exposed her as the imposter she feared she was? But no, Maria refused to let those thoughts take over. She focused only on the problem in front of her, and with each passing minute her certainty grew. She could hear Dr. McGowan's sharp intake of breath as Maria reached the midpoint of the equation. There was a flicker of recognition in the professor's eyes, something Maria hadn't expected. Dr. McGowan had been watching, waiting for her to slip up. But instead of a mistake, something else was happening. Maria wasn't just solving the problem, she was doing it in a way that no one in this room had ever considered. Dr. McGowan's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. The smugness that had initially been so apparent in her demeanor began to fade, replaced by something else, something harder to identify. Maria wasn't just solving the equation. She was uncovering a new way to approach it, a method that was outside the bounds of what had been taught in the textbooks. Maria's chalk moved fluidly, breaking down the complex structure of the equation. In a series of unexpected steps, her unconventional method bypassed several steps, reducing the complexity of the problem with a series of deft substitutions and transformations. She glanced over at Dr. McGowan, who was watching her closely now. The professor's eyes flicked back and forth between Maria's solution and the original equation on the board, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable. Every student now fully focused on the process unfolding in front of them. No one dared to speak, no one dared to move. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. Maria's hand trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. She was too close. The final step was in front of her, and she could already see the solution. Clear, precise, beautiful. She completed the last transformation, her chalk moving with the grace of someone who had solved this problem 100 times before, even though this was the first time anyone else had ever seen it. She drew the final line and enclosed her answer in a neat, confident box. The room remained completely silent for a long moment. Maria turned slowly, her eyes meeting Dr. McGowan's. The professor's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something, but the words never came. Instead, she stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and examined the work on the board with a scrutiny that bordered on disbelief. Maria stood there, holding her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had solved the equation, but the question now was whether Dr. McGowan would acknowledge it or tear her down for her audacity to challenge the accepted methods. The professor's eyes scanned the board, her gaze flicking back to Maria, then to the equation. This approach, Dr. McGowan finally spoke, her voice low and measured. It's unorthodox. Her words hung in the air, heavy with judgment. Maria's pulse quickened. She could feel the eyes of the class on her, their judgment a palpable force. But there was something else now, something that wasn't there before. Unorthodox? Maria echoed quietly, trying to steady her voice. But it works. I didn't just follow the steps. I thought through the problem. I broke it down, simplified it. Dr. McGowan stepped back, her lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of approval, but something more complex, a mixture of begrudging respect and disdain. Indeed, Dr. McGowan said, her voice colder now. It works, yes, but that's not the issue, is it? It's the fact that you've ignored all the rules. This is not how we solve problems here. Her tone was sharp, cutting through the room. Maria swallowed, her mind racing. Was this going to be it? Was Dr. McGowan going to dismiss her, claim her solution was flawed, just because it wasn't the proper way? The solution is correct, Dr. McGowan continued, but her voice was laced with disdain. But it is an error in judgment to think you can simply discard the methods we've established here. Do you understand? Maria's heart sank, but she refused to back down. I don't want to discard the methods, she said quietly, her voice firm despite the rising tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I just want to see the problem in a different way, to challenge what's been done before. For a moment, the classroom was completely still. The students, once so ready to mock her, were now silent, uncertain. They had watched Maria dismantle the equation with an ease that few of them could have matched. They had watched as the problem that had once seemed impossible unraveled under her hands. Dr. McGowan's eyes flickered toward the class, then back to Maria. For a brief, fleeting moment, Maria thought she saw a hint of respect in the professor's. A gaze, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Dr. McGowan's lips pressed together in a thin, tight line. You may have solved it, she said finally, her voice colder than ever. But that doesn't mean you belong here. Maria's chest tightened, the words cutting deep. She had been so close to proving herself. And yet here she stood, still an outsider in their eyes. The room was still, a heavy silence hanging in the air. Maria's heart pounded as Dr. McGowan turned toward the board once again. Let's move on, Dr. McGowan announced, her voice final. The next problem. But the tension hadn't left the room. In fact, it had only grown. Maria had done what they all thought was impossible. She had solved the equation in a way no one had ever considered. And yet, she was still being dismissed. It wasn't over. The real test, Maria realized, had just begun. The classroom was deadly silent. The tension hung in the air like an oppressive storm cloud, ready to burst at any moment. Maria stood at the chalkboard, sweat beading on her forehead, but she didn't dare wipe it away. Her hands gripped the chalk so tightly, her fingers ached. Each movement, each equation she wrote down felt like the final test, a test of everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of. Dr. McGowan stood just behind her, arms crossed, her eyes locked on Maria's every move. The other students, once smug and condescending, were now leaning forward, their eyes wide with fascination. No one had expected this. Maria wasn't supposed to be able to do it. She wasn't supposed to be able to outsmart them all. But there she was, methodically breaking down the complex equation, with an ease and grace that left even Dr. McGowan momentarily stunned. The equation was an elaborate beast of multivariable calculus, a structure of nested integrals, difficult substitutions, and careful transformations. It was the kind of problem that required not just knowledge, but ingenuity. Maria's mind had instantly recognized the most efficient way to approach it, cutting through the complexity in a way that was elegant, even beautiful. With each step, she unwound the equation, making it appear simpler than it had any right to be. The classroom watched in stunned silence as Maria's chalk glided across the board. Even Dr. McGowan, the master of this domain, was starting to shift. Uneasily, she had been expecting Maria to fail, to stumble, to show herself as the imposter Dr. McGowan had so easily labeled her. But Maria wasn't failing. She wasn't just solving the problem, she was doing it better, faster, and with a level of insight that even the seasoned mathematicians in the room couldn't deny. Maria's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let it show. This was her moment. This was what she had worked for, what she had dreamed about since the days she had hidden her notebooks filled with equations under her bed. She wasn't just proving something to them, she was proving something to herself. She belonged here, in this world of numbers and theories. As she wrote the final line of the equation, she boxed her answer neatly and turned around slowly, meeting Dr. McGowan's cold, calculating gaze. The room remained silent, but the air between them crackled with an unspoken challenge. Dr. McGowan's lips pressed into a thin line as she stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She leaned in close to the board, her eyes scanning the solution, her brow furrowed in concentration. The students remained silent, watching as their professor's face shifted from curiosity to something darker. For a long moment, Dr. McGowan didn't speak. Maria's pulse raced, but she stood tall, refusing to show any sign of fear. She had done it. She had solved the equation in a way no one had thought to. She had proven them all wrong. Maria's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. She wouldn't let Dr. McGowan belittle her. Not now, not when she'd worked so hard to get here. "It's not just about following the steps," Maria said quietly, her voice steady, despite the surge of emotion within her. "It's about understanding the problem, seeing it from a different perspective. The solution was there. I found it." Dr. McGowan didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned toward the board, tapping her fingers on the desk as though deep in thought. The classroom remained still, as if holding its collective breath. But Dr. McGowan, never one to admit defeat easily, exhaled sharply and turned back to the class. "Interesting," she said, her voice colder than it had been before, "but not sufficient." Maria's stomach dropped. Not sufficient? Her solution was flawless. She had solved it faster and more elegantly than anyone could have imagined, but Dr. McGowan wasn't impressed. Instead, she was looking for something to criticize, something to diminish Maria's achievement. Dr. McGowan's eyes locked onto Maria once more. "You've solved the equation," she said slowly, almost as if tasting the words before she spoke them. "But you've done so by ignoring the very foundations of what we've been taught. You bypassed steps, you used shortcuts that should not have been used. It's not proper." The words stung, cutting deeper than Maria expected. She had done it the best way she knew how, efficient, precise, and yet, in Dr. McGowan's eyes, it wasn't enough. It wasn't the right way. Then, without warning, Dr. McGowan's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Well then, Ms. Dela Cruz, let's see how you handle this." She quickly scribbled another equation on the board, one even more complex than the first. It was a multi-dimensional integral with several boundary conditions that seemed impossible to solve within the given time. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she looked at the equation. This was a different kind of beast, one that even the most advanced students would hesitate to take on. But Dr. McGowan wasn't offering Maria a choice. The challenge was set. "You have 5 minutes, Dr. McGowan said, her eyes gleaming, with something darker. "Let's see if you can solve this one." Maria's hands trembled slightly as she stepped toward the board. She could feel the weight of the challenge bearing down on her, the tension in the room growing by the second. But she couldn't afford to let fear control her. She had come too far. She had fought too hard to let this be the end, the equation. On the board was a tangled mess of symbols, a complex puzzle that would require every ounce of her intellect and determination. It was a race against time. The clock was ticking down, and Maria knew that if she didn't solve it, Dr. McGowan would have the last word. The judgment of the class would shift back in Dr. McGowan's favor. Maria could feel the eyes of the students on her again, judging, watching, waiting. But Maria wasn't just fighting to solve this equation. She was fighting for her place here. She was fighting to prove that talent didn't have to be measured by credentials, by the letters on a diploma. It had to be about ability, passion, determination. Her chalk moved against the board with purpose. Each line, each calculation brought her closer to the solution. But it wasn't just about solving it. This equation was different. The steps didn't follow the traditional path. There were dead ends, twists in the method that made it seem impossible. But Maria's mind was sharp, her intuition guiding her through the darkness. She didn't just solve the problem. She found a new way to solve it, an approach that was even more efficient than the standard methods. The classroom was silent now, no one daring to interrupt. The clock was ticking down, but Maria's focus remained unwavering. She could hear Dr. McGowan's quiet breaths behind her, the professor watching closely, trying to catch her in a mistake. But Maria had already anticipated that. Every step she took was calculated, every move deliberate. And then, just as the last second ticked away, Maria completed the final line. She boxed the answer, her hand still steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. She turned slowly, facing the class, her heart pounding in her chest. The solution was there. Perfect, elegant, efficient. The room remained silent. Every student, every professor was looking at her. But it wasn't a look of mockery anymore. No, now there was something else in their eyes. Respect, curiosity, awe. Dr. McGowan stepped forward slowly, her eyes scanning the board, her face unreadable. She said nothing for several moments. Maria's heart beat louder than the ticking clock. Finally, Dr. McGowan turned back to her, a faint flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps respect, perhaps regret. But before Maria could savor the moment, Dr. McGowan spoke, her voice colder than ever. "Well done, Ms. Dela Cruz," she said, her tone chillingly neutral. "But this isn't enough." Maria's stomach twisted. She had done it. She had solved it. She had proved herself. But it still wasn't enough. "I think we've seen enough for today," Dr. McGowan said, turning away, her final words hanging in the air. As the students began to pack up, Maria felt a sense of dread wash over her. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. She had fought so hard, but the game was still being played by rules she hadn't agreed to, and Dr. McGowan had one final card to play. The tension was far from over. The clock ticked down with an almost malevolent slowness. Maria's eyes flicked between the complicated equation on the board and the students watching her, waiting for her to stumble. Her hands, once trembling, were now steady, her mind razor-focused. The murmurs around her had quieted to an oppressive silence, leaving only the sound of chalk meeting the board, the only rhythm that mattered now. Maria could feel Dr. McGowan's gaze drilling into the back of her head. The professor's presence was suffocating, but Maria refused to acknowledge the weight of it. The time for doubt had passed. This was no longer about proving she was capable. This was about showing everyone that she could think, solve, and do what no one expected her to. The students who had mocked her, who had written her off as nothing more than an outsider, were now watching with anticipation. She wasn't here to make excuses for herself. She wasn't here to beg for their approval. No, Maria was here to show them that talent transcended the confines of pedigree and formal education. She was here to prove that the rules they clung to weren't the only way to succeed. With every stroke of the chalk, she felt more confident. She saw the equation for what it was, not an obstacle, but an opportunity, a challenge designed to expose her, but one she would dismantle methodically. The steps, though complex, were now familiar, almost intuitive to her. Where others would hesitate, Maria found solutions. She wasn't just solving it the way they had taught her, the way they had expected her to. She was solving it in a way that made sense to her. Her hand moved quickly across the board, each line connecting the pieces of the equation with ease. With every step, Maria felt the tension in the room shift. It was no longer just a battle of intellect, it was a battle of will, a battle to prove she belonged here, to prove that her self-taught mind was just as capable, if not more, than those who had been formally trained. 5 minutes passed. The students, once poised to mock her, now sat on the edge of their seats, their eyes wide with disbelief. Maria had done it. She had solved the equation in a way that was not only correct but far more efficient than anyone had imagined. And then there was the silence, the heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Dr. McGowan stepped forward, her eyes scanning the solution on the board. Her face was unreadable, but Maria could feel the weight of her scrutiny. Dr. McGowan's lips pressed into a thin line as she stood there, her gaze flicking between Maria's work and the textbook answer. Maria's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. Had she done something wrong? Had she missed a step? The room felt too still, too quiet. And then Dr. McGowan spoke. "Well done, Ms. Delacruz," she said, her tone clipped but tinged with something more, a begrudging respect. Perhaps, or maybe just disbelief. Maria wasn't sure. "You've solved the problem. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that your solution is impressive." Maria's chest swelled with pride. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a recognition she had longed for. She had done what no one thought she could. She had earned a moment of acknowledgement from the very professor who had dismissed her from the start. But the relief was short-lived. "As I said before, though," Dr. McGowan continued, her voice cool and measured, "you've used an unorthodox approach, one that, while effective, is not the way we solve problems here." Maria's heart dropped. The victory was slipping through her fingers. Dr. McGowan was always looking for something to dismiss her for. She was always going to find a flaw. "You've shown that you can solve the equation," Dr. McGowan said, her voice growing colder. "But what you've done is akin to cutting corners. It's not the proper way to approach mathematics." Maria could feel her face heating, her mind racing. She had done it right. She had solved it in a way that made sense to her. But none of that mattered to Dr. McGowan. None of it mattered because it didn't follow the rules that had kept Maria out, the rules that were built to keep people like her from ever truly being seen. The silence that followed Dr. McGowan's words was suffocating. Maria's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She was about to speak, about to tell Dr. McGowan that she had solved the problem in her own way, that her method was just as valid as any other. But before she could, Dr. McGowan spoke again. "But," she said, her voice ringing out with finality, "this is where the issue lies. You may have solved the equation, Ms. Delacruz, but you're still not qualified to be here." The words cut deeper than any equation ever could. Maria's chest tightened. Her heart ached, her mind a storm of emotions, anger, frustration, humiliation. Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to prove, was still being dismissed by the very system she had hoped to break into. Dr. McGowan's eyes didn't soften. "I'm afraid I have no choice but to expel you from this program," she said, her voice cold and authoritative. "You may have talent, Ms. Delacruz, but without credentials, without the proper education, you are a liability to this program. We can't afford to make exceptions." Maria felt the weight of her words. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she felt as though she might collapse under the crushing weight of it all. Expelled, after everything. She had solved the equation, she had proven her worth, and yet it wasn't enough. The students around her stirred uncomfortably, the tension in the room thickening. Some of them exchanged glances, unsure of what to do or say. But others, those who had once mocked her, who had thought her nothing more than an outsider, now looked at her with something else in their eyes, something like respect. Dr. McGowan turned her back on Maria, effectively dismissing her from the room. "Class dismissed," she said, her voice sharp. Maria stood frozen for a moment, her eyes lingering on Dr. McGowan's retreating figure. The finality of the professor's words echoed in her ears, but something inside her refused to crumble. She had solved the problem. She had proved herself, and no one could take that away from her, not even Dr. McGowan. The students began to gather their things, some glancing at Maria with a newfound respect, others merely ignoring her presence. But one student, a young woman who had whispered about Maria earlier, walked up to her. "That was incredible," the student said, her voice low but filled with admiration. "How did you do that without formal training? I've never seen anyone approach it like that." Maria smiled faintly, but the sadness behind her eyes was undeniable. "I just see things differently," she replied softly. "I guess that's what makes it work for me." The student nodded, clearly in awe of what Maria had accomplished. "I've never seen anyone solve it that way. You should share your method with the rest of us. It's incredible." Maria felt a surge of pride, despite the weight of the expulsion hanging over her. She had earned this moment. She had shown them all that she belonged here. Even if she had been expelled from the program, she had earned something more important: respect. As she walked out of the lecture hall, Maria could feel the eyes of the students on her. This time they weren't filled with mockery. They weren't filled with doubt. They were filled with something different: recognition. And though Dr. McGowan's rejection stung, Maria knew that she had done something that couldn't be undone. She wasn't just a self-taught math enthusiast anymore. She was a force. And no matter what Dr. McGowan said, no matter what the system tried to impose on her, Maria had found her place in the world. Her phone buzzed as she walked down the corridor, an email from the program's assistant. Her scholarship offer officially rescinded, but with a note that read, "If you're interested, we would be happy to discuss a future opportunity." Maria didn't need to read the rest. The world didn't define her. She would define herself. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the streets outside the university. Maria walked slowly, her footsteps echoing on the pavement, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The expulsion from the program still stung, despite the fact that she had just solved an equation that no one, not even Dr. McGowan, had thought possible. But it wasn't just about the problem anymore, was it? It was about something much bigger. It was about her. It was about what she had proved, not just to others, but to herself. The world outside the university felt different now. The cool breeze swept across her face, and Maria couldn't help but close her eyes for a moment, letting it carry away the weight of the day. The campus had been cold, and she had felt like an outsider in that vast lecture hall. But walking down the street now, she felt lighter, even if just for a fleeting moment. She had walked into that room thinking she was out of place, thinking she had to prove her worth to people who would never accept her. And now, with the sun sinking below the horizon, she felt something shift inside her. She had done it. She had proven to herself that she was more than just a self-taught mathematician, more than just an outsider. She was capable. She was brilliant. And for the first time, Maria allowed herself to feel pride, but it wasn't all triumph. As Maria reached the bus stop, she took out her phone, her fingers trembling just a little as she unlocked it. She had been so focused on the moment of solving the problem, on the rush of adrenaline, that she hadn't checked her email. But now, with the quiet hum of the evening around her, it felt like the right time. A new message. It was from the department. "Dear Ms. Dela Cruz, I want to extend my congratulations on your extraordinary mathematical abilities. Although your lack of formal credentials led to your unfortunate expulsion from the program, your solution to the equation demonstrated a rare depth of understanding and creative insight. We recognize your talent and believe that you could contribute immensely to the program if you were willing to formalize your education with us. We would be honored to offer you a scholarship to join our program as a formal student, despite the unconventional path you've taken. I understand this may seem unexpected, but your raw brilliance cannot be overlooked. Please let me know if you are interested in discussing this opportunity further. Best regards, Professor Allen." Maria stared at the screen, the words swimming before her eyes. She blinked, then read the email again and again. Her breath caught in her throat. A scholarship, an opportunity to join the program officially, to have her brilliance recognized, her lack of credentials no longer an obstacle. It was everything she had ever wanted, but it was also so much more than that. It was a second chance. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but her mind was a whirl of thoughts. She had been expelled from the program. Her solution had been dismissed by Dr. McGowan as unorthodox, improper. And yet here was the department head, offering her the very thing she had worked so hard for. She should have been elated, overjoyed. This was her dream, but instead, a knot of uncertainty twisted in her stomach. What would it mean to accept? What would it mean to go back to that same system, to be a part of the very structure that had cast her aside? Was it worth it to go back, to be part of something that had already rejected her once? Maria stood at the bus stop, the evening settling. In around her, the world moved on, indifferent to her inner turmoil. The bus would arrive soon, and she would need to make a choice. She knew, deep down, what the right decision was. She had proven herself. She didn't need anyone's approval, but the scholarship, the opportunity, was the kind of thing that could change her life. It could open doors, give her the formal training she had never had. It could give her the legitimacy that had always been denied to her. But was that what she truly wanted? Was it worth sacrificing the independence she had fought so hard for? Or was it time to finally break free of the chains that had bound her to the traditional system? She could feel her heart beating faster now. The uncertainty was eating away, and her, threatening to overwhelm her. Maria took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She couldn't let fear dictate her next move. She couldn't let the past weigh her down. She had earned this. She had solved that equation. She had proven she belonged in that room. She didn't need anyone else to tell her that, but still, the opportunity was so tempting. As the bus pulled up to the stop, Maria's decision felt clear. She couldn't go back to the program. She had already proved she was more than just a formal education. She had earned her place through hard work and raw talent. To return would be to accept the limitations they had placed on her, and Maria wasn't about to let herself be limited any longer. She stepped onto the bus, the doors sliding shut behind her. She felt lighter with each step she took away from the university, away from the weight of their expectations. The decision had been made. She would continue on her own path, wherever it led. And for the first time in a long time, Maria felt confident in her choice. The bus rumbled down the street, the city fading behind her. As the lights of the city blurred in the distance, Maria's thoughts drifted. The email had been a surprise, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered now. What mattered was that she had proven herself, and that, she realized, was more valuable than any degree or scholarship. She smiled to herself, the bus carrying her away from the familiar streets of the university, but closer to something far more important, herself. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was someone who had earned the respect of those who doubted her, someone who had rewritten her own story. Maria leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. The world ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of possibilities. Maria's journey reminds us that true brilliance doesn't conform to societal expectations. It's born from passion, perseverance, and the courage to challenge the status quo. Sometimes, the most extraordinary minds come from the most unexpected places. Let's celebrate talent in all its forms. If Maria's story inspired you, please like, comment, and share. Let's spread the message that greatness isn't defined by appearances or background, but by the strength to rise above limitations. Keep the conversation going. What do you think about the way talent and potential are often overlooked in traditional systems? How do you relate to Maria's struggle? Share your thoughts with us.